Spam! 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 You weren't ready for that, were you?
No.
Yes.
We were talking about William Jennings Bryan a little while ago, right?
Mm-hmm. 1896. We'll talk about him again.
Was he the guy in the Scopes monkey trial?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if you read Inherit the Wind, they really make him look like a fool.
Yeah.
And that's totally unfair.
I was in the panel.
Huh?
I just made that connection. So.
Oh, yeah, did you? Yeah, the thing about he hated social Darwinism so much that he associated evolution with social Darwinism. He was incorrect, but that's why.
And also, wasn't he like pretty religious?
Oh, yeah. That was an element. The big thing was social Darwinism.
Okay.
But they tried to play him, and so many people have said as being intolerant to other religions. And that wasn't quite him. He had his issues. People out there have issues. I know, you're right. No one in here does. I should add that I'm going through the Jungle reading, and people are doing very well on it. I really like how you have to tie cutthroat competition to all of that. Does everyone have the Jungle? I gave that to you guys, so you have that. So it's due today. I gave everyone another day. Please get that in. And does anyone have a paper copy they want to give me, or they turn it online? We're good? Okay. You turn it online or give it to me tomorrow. I will take it then. And we're on kind of works A-Day, B-Day. Yes.
Also, another question. Have you read any now?
Yeah, I've had to read. I had to read a Little Red Book a long time ago. It's been a long time. He's interesting, but he's also shockingly duplicitous. Yeah. Duplicitous. He says one thing but means another thing. Do you have to read now, or just? Or?
No, I just found a copy, so it's just.
Yeah, I've had to read a few different things about it, but his ideas on guerrilla fighting were actually really interesting.
Yeah.
But I had to teach a class, TA, in grad school on China, so I had to read it. But that was a long time ago. It just reminded me how long ago that was. Yeah.
Like how it's like not just spam on top of the pancake, it's spam literally inside.
Yeah. So when you cook it, the spam actually comes to the top. It's beautiful. It's heavenly. Velveeta. Yes.
My dad actually has a recipe with like brown sugar and mustard and Spanish.
Sure. Yeah. Hey, spam, a lot of people haven't tried, but it's just ground up meat. If you like a hot dog, or sausage, you probably like spam. Boy, does it have salt. My dad really liked spam, but they had no money when he was a little kid, and so it was protein, meat, and they craved it. He still likes it, I know I'm not really a fan, but I've had to eat it. So did we get to? Did I show this video yesterday in class? I think I showed these. So what was the amendment that said that the United States would allow Cuba to be independent, but didn't bother to say anybody else? What was that amendment? From yesterday. Yes. Yeah, the Teller Amendment. By the way, you like I'm experimenting with the NK94 mask. You like it? It's actually pretty nice, and it's supposed to be the best. Was it the NA or whatever 95? There's so many counterfeits you can't trust. Stop trying with these. It's actually pretty good. It's better than it's shockingly comfortable. But you have to get it from Korea. I guess they really thought of comfort. They wear masks all the time, so I guess they're used to it. And speaking of that, what was the letter where they called McKinley, the Spanish ambassador to the United States, called McKinley weak and ineffectual? The letter from the Spanish ambassador. What was that called? And if you don't have this, you are responsible for this. Yes. You have the letter? Anybody have the letter? McKinley was weak and ineffectual. We got the other one. We should have had this. I'm recording this. Just you good? Recording good. That's the long letter. And what battleship blew up?
Maine.
Yeah, the Maine. They blamed the Spanish, of course. Talk about, oh, who got the Rough Riders? Invited to fame? What person? And when the United States went to war, this showed the war was purely for empire. The U.S. did not attack Cuba and try to stop those reconcentration camps. No, where did the U.S. attack first? What Spanish colony? What Spanish colony did the United States attack first? Yeah, the Philippines, named after King Philip II. Yes, the Philippines. So let's go and get to this. We got the Santiago, we got the Rough Riders. I showed you the video. So you don't need to know these numbers. I just put this up here to give you an idea how many people died in part one of this. There's how many American soldiers. You notice how many more died of disease. And these are the Spanish figures. And it could be higher, we're not clear. But about half died of yellow fever, one of the mosquito-borne illnesses. The other half died of food poisoning. That's why spam is up there, yes. This is the first time where you have people eating processed food for every meal. They're already eating canned processed foods, but not all the time. So people might get sick, or the odds were lower you would have to eat something that was pretty bad for you, but processed foods, let's be honest about it, you have no idea what's in there. None. And if you think you do, you say, oh, look at the ingredients. Well, tell me what the ingredients mean. And that's why I had you read The Jungle, because you don't know what's actually going in. But that was the big argument the progressives had for regulation, because companies will cut corners to make money, especially since they're probably not the one eating those foods. Yeah.
I thought it was funny, like, they literally use borax in food, like, it's a cleaning agent.
Borax is a toxic cleaning agent, but what it does, it colors. But the big thing borax does, it masks the smell. So let's say they don't sell meat. What they would do is they would just stick it in the basement of the slaughterhouses. Not refrigerated, just stick it down there and it'll kind of petrify and spoil and do this great thing. They mention it in The Jungle as that petrified meat. And then when the army made all these orders for food, they put it in the hopper, which grinds it up, but it's rotten, it's spoiled. So what do? You add a bunch of stuff to it, gravy and other things. It masks the smell and the color. I mean, think about how many things in canned foods have this liquid in it. Sure, it might be the sauce, so to speak, but it also masks the color and also masks the smell. And also, they were still using solder to solder the cans. That's lead. And lead is, we are still learning how bad lead is. It is significantly worse than we thought even 10 years. We now know it's significantly worse than we thought 10 years ago. That's how much we've learned about lead. Huh?
The C.R. Anderson, that crisis.
So hey, they put lead in gasoline. So when I was your age, I was sucking up probably 100 times more lead than you were. So that makes me more violent. Just let me know. Actually, the amount of lead in the air has gone down. The amount of violent crime has gone down all over the world. It's really true.
Oh, that's Flint, Michigan.
Yeah, that's part of it because of the pipes and the soldering in it. And they just simply started using the old pipes to pump the water because it deal. And yeah.
Our government is still failing.
So, and yeah, it especially affects little kids. That's actually really scary. And yeah, my generation is more violent, which is disconcerting. I've told this story before. When I first started teaching, there were fights every day. I'd have to break up a fight all the time because I was kind of big and young. Every day. When's the last time there's been a fight in the school? I don't think there's been one this year. Last year there was a big deal, like there was one fight between a couple of freshmen. All the time in the cafeteria. And I'd have to come running down and grab this guy. You just aren't as tough as my generation. Okay, moving on. But all these people died. And then The Jungle came out, it's no coincidence, 7 years later. No coincidence. So with that, let's get to a few things about this then. First off, spam. One more time.
Please go to the next slide.
So, the Treaty of Paris was signed, but not ratified by the Senate, but 1898, another Treaty of Paris, right? Remember what I told you, when in doubt, Paris. And it's a little bit like the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Just notice those, perfect. It matches the shirt, and I like being a little bit ironic since it's February. So, Cuba's independent, but we never defined what independent was. The United States got Puerto Rico and Guam. These were Spanish colonies. Now, the island of Guam, and they're still American colonies. And the United States paid $20 million for the Philippines. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States paid $15 million for the Mexican cession. So we can act like it wasn't a war of conquest. And so this is so the U.S. could say, oh, and just incidentally, we purchased the Philippines. By the way, we meant to colonize it, which is quite a shock to the Filipinos. And there's this, that's the signing of the Treaty in Paris, but it has to go to the Senate and be ratified by 2/3. And there was a huge and growing anti-imperialist league against this treaty. I should add, still territories. And Puerto Rico is a commonwealth, it's called, but it's a territory. Puerto Ricans are American citizens, so they're citizens of the United States just as we are, but they do not have the right to vote because they're not a state. So they can't vote for president. They don't have a member of Congress that has a vote. They have a member of Congress who sits and watches. And it's a little bit amazing. Puerto Rico has a significantly larger population than Montana. And if they're citizens, they, I would be a little upset if I was a Puerto Rican because they can just get dictated to by Washington, D.C. So with that, this is a cartoon made right after the Spanish surrender. And remember yesterday I kept saying, look at the faces, how they draw the Cubans. Now look at the face. Hawaii, or no, it's Philippines, Hawaii. Now they're all part of the Union. And don't those faces look at that face with Queen Liliuokalani I showed you the other day? Look at the faces they showed to justify slavery. Now they're trying to show that these little children, not quite humans, should be dominated by the United States. It shifts sympathy for them if we want to go to war. Now it's domination. Let's make them inferiors. And there are so many cartoons like this one. This one is the most stark one. It shows McKinley like a schoolmaster. He's sweating in the sun, like he doesn't want to be there, but he has to teach his unruly class. And look how they draw Cuba, Hawaii, Philippines, and Puerto Rico. And look at the faces. And so, take into account, don't forget, the most racist time in history is this era, combined with trying to justify our dominance. Can we let them be independent? So it's implying it's our duty to teach them. And remember I showed you the other day that pear soap ad? How they had that little baby who, when they used soap, they became more white. You see this on the board? Soap. Have you used it? Will civilize these dirty people. It's horrifically racist, but now it's to justify conquering them and holding them. So the growing Anti-Imperialist League was bitterly divided. And this is a keep business from getting rich off imperialism. That's what says monopoly on this top hat. But you look at the leaders. Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labor. Mark Twain, who by then was the most famous author in America. Carnegie was an interesting guy. And William Jennings Bryan, who we just mentioned. Bryan was going to run for president again. And he was going to try to ride the wave of anti-imperialistic feeling. Carnegie even offered to buy the Philippines for $10 million and let them become independent. Of course, he was turned down, but that shows his anti-imperialistic feelings, but also shows he had a lot of extra money sitting around. You have to be extraordinarily wealthy to offer $10 million to buy the Philippines. At that time, it's a crazy amount of money. We're talking somewhere around $500 to $1 billion. It's hard to directly relate money. Well, there are reasons, though. Oh, so they're against imperialism, and they focus on we shouldn't annex the Philippines. thus against the treaty, thus against the T of Paris. So they're against this treaty, and they're thinking if we can keep the Senate from getting 2/3 to ratify it, this could be a big shift. And Bryan was thinking, I could be president with this. So the reasons why America, they believe, should be for self-determination, just as the founding fathers overthrew British imperialists. We should let the Philippines do it. We should not be the imperial power. Now, this, of course, disregards the history of the American West, but still, that's the way they look at it. That comes back to the elements of the Declaration of Independence they wanted to believe the U.S. stood for. We have a very complex history. Also, though, there's a serious element of racism. We don't want those darker-skinned people. No more of them, or especially if they're going to come in and steal our jobs. So there was this element of racism. We want to still be the white republic, which, of course, the United States was not. And lastly, there's a real fear that corporations would get rich with an empire, and part of the way they would get rich by going to war all the time. Think how much money the steel industry could make if they have to sell steel armor for the new battleships we need to defend our empire. Or for that matter, you go to war, there'll be a whole new munitions industry be created that didn't exist in the United States. And now it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry in the United States. And I should add, you can say this is a good thing or bad thing, but this would happen. And it is happening now. In fact, President Biden is talking about, well, he said a commission, he likes commissions, to look into pulling out fully out of Afghanistan. And members of the commission who are desperate, this came out just this morning, who want us to stay in Afghanistan, almost all of them have direct ties to companies like Lockheed Martin that make munitions. And so my point is, their fears would be right. Now you could say this is a good thing or bad thing, but boy, would they be correct. But then Bryan undercut the whole thing. William Jennings Bryan thought, nobody cares about this in 2 years. Just ratify the treaty, I can still be president, and I will let the Philippines become independent. So he dropped his opposition, and without the cover of Bryan, and money was flowing hands freely, flowing through very freely, the treaty ratified. And so there's a picture of Bryan as a court jester, a man you could not trust as being opposed to the treaty. And yes, it's also intensely racist, but that's another story. And it would be at this time that The Wizard of Oz would be written. And they had William Jennings Bryan as a colony dog. And Bryan never recovered from this. This would be the vote, by the way, but he never recovered his reputation. He got the reputation of a man you could not trust, a blowhard, and it would really hurt him. But we'll come back to Bryan. He'd run for president 3 times total. He'd also be Woodrow Wilson Secretary of State, and like you said, we'll get to the Scopes Monkey trial. Well, now the United States has an empire, and a series of court cases wound their way to the Supreme Court called the Insular Cases. Insular means like an island. So that's what it means, like an island. And here's the big question. Does the Constitution follow the flag? Meaning, do the people of the Philippines have rights? Does the Bill of Rights apply there? And for that matter, do they have democracy? Can they vote and decide their own government? Because if they can, you know what the first thing they'll do is vote us out. And the Supreme Court ruled, and this was a big deal because this contradicted previous rulings. No, the Constitution does not directly follow the flag. People in these areas do not necessarily have rights. And you notice I'm using a lot of weasel words. So they don't have rights. This is a big deal because we live in Montana. And at least, well, at the time it was only for a limited amount, but right now, Montana was taken and then conquered by the United States, and we technically have all the rights of state of New York City. It's not that way outside the borders. This is a big deal. We'll come back to this, but this was an troubles that follow the imperial policy, and that's supposed to be the Philippines trying to ask for rights, but this is also saying it's a savage. The members of this form were calling him savage, which, by the way, not at all. But this was using racism to control. So in 1903, the United States finally dictated to Cuba what's going to happen to Cuba. We're still occupying it. We, not we in the classroom, the United States is. So what the United States said is Cuba will become a protectorate. I've mentioned protectorates before. That meant that they can sign no treaties with any other country. So the U.S. controls its foreign policy, which means controls its trade. And Cuba has sugar, but also mines. Really valuable mines for the production of steel. Copper, tin, nickel, bauxite, things like that. And so, next, if Cuba does something wrong, we can intervene. Intervene means send in whom? Troops. That's where the Marines would become kind of an independent body to intervene in places like Cuba, which they would be sent in 5 times. Or threaten. You want the Marines to come back and take over the government to do what we want? Which, by the way, you can imagine this is going to build up a lot of resentment in Cuba. There's a reason Fidel Castro would become the most popular leader Cuba ever had, because he stood up to the United States. We'll come to Castro. His brother's still in charge, Raul Castro. Does that remind you of another brother? Raul Castro.
He's in Cuba.
He's in Cuba. So here's Uncle Sam as a father, and we're teaching Cuba. Let's be clear about it. Here's what the Cubans felt. Do you see it? Cuba being branded with U.S. That's actually a pretty good contrast of the views of the imperialists and those who are being, Next, the U.S. is going to have to lease a base. So we have a Navy base right there in case we need to intervene. And this would intimidate the Cubans. Guantanamo Bay will be on the eastern coast. It was a relatively undeveloped bay, really good for a naval harbor, so it's a big naval base. The U.S. was supposed to be a 100-year lease, but the U.S. has just stayed, and it's still a naval base. You might know it as something else, a prison. And the reason why it would become a prison is after the United States was attacked on September 11th, and then the U.S. got involved in the civil war in Afghanistan, we didn't actually invade. It's much more complex. In 2001, we started giving money for people. We basically just started handing money out. Show us where the terrorists were they're attacked. And people just started turning in people for money. And we had no idea if they were terrorists or just some poor sucker who sold out for some money. And we didn't know what to do with it. But we were terrified of another terrorist attack. But we didn't want to take them to the United States. Because if they go to the United States, they have something, even if they're not citizens, they have something called rights. Remember the Insular Cases? The Constitution does not follow the flag. So where did we send them? We sent them to the naval base at Guantanamo Bay and made a prison. And that's exactly what happened. They were tortured.
Remember, Obama said Guantanamo Bay is going to be closed. And that did the same thing.
And that wasn't a priority for him. And it's still there. But that's why Guantanamo Bay was used. Because it was a gray area if they had rights, so they could be tortured. Because torture is against American law. So we do it outside the borders. And that's why Guantanamo was there. Naval bases are huge. So they literally just set up a barbed wire fence and put tents in, and now it's a full-fledged prison. Next, Guantanamo or Cuba can have no excessive public spending. Public spending means money for schools, roads, sewers, water supply. They don't want any debt. And the reason why is this. They know Cuba's going to have trouble raising money because American businesses are going to come in. So this will help creditors. They want to make sure that the creditors who loan money to Cuba will get their money back. And who's loaning money to Cuba? American banks. And so this was a very conscious policy. This is economic imperialism. And it become part of a greater policy called big stick diplomacy. And so that's the Platt Amendment. No, Cuba was not given a choice. The US dictated this to Cuba. And by the way, all this, what type of government then did the United States want?
A dictatorship.
The US wanted a dictator. So anytime there'd be a threat of democracy, the US would send in the Marines. And so all through the 1950s, a very brutal, nasty dictator named Batista, he brought in the mafia, this is horrific dictator. He'd be the guy that'd be replaced by Fidel Castro. So with that, we're going to jump right to this. The peace treaty was signed. But do you notice something wrong with this headline? If you have peace treaty signed, do you catch it?
Water.
We got part two. Do you see where it's at? In the Philippines. The people of the Philippines thought they were going to be independent, and they were furious that now they're going to be under another colonial rule. Yeah.
On the separate note, so Philippines is spelled with a PH.
Here we go.
Instead of it's
Yeah.
an F.
Yeah.
Can you spell Filipino with PH?
You can, but you'd be wrong.
You'd be wrong.
Yeah. But with the English language. And in fact, it would be this word, Filipino, and well, tied up with Philippines, why Teddy Roosevelt actually pushed to make the English language taught in America more phonetically spelled. So you'd have F instead of PH. Because, yeah, it's Philippines PH, Filipino F. Yeah, you caught that. Isn't that fun? Don't you love the English language? The war was basically done by 1903, but they'll still be fighting on one of the big islands, the second biggest island of the Philippines called Mindanao, until 1908. That's why I have that there. And it was bloody, horrible fighting. And guerrilla attacks, American reprisals. This is the outcome of an American reprisal on Filipino civilians. Killed by American soldiers. And the Americans will learn. Well, they kept this secret. They censored the media, but this will come the price of empire. What you must do to have an empire. We should have learned a little of this in American history, because if you look at this and are shocked, don't forget places like Wounded Knee or Sand Creek. Remember I mentioned those? But this was an imperial war. And the United States would find a justification by saying, we're bringing civilization. And here's McKinley saving the Philippines from Spanish rule over a cliff. And civilization and Christianity. In fact, McKinley said, I had a dream. And God came to me in the dream and told me it's my duty to bring Christianity to the Filipinos. And that actually appealed to a lot of Americans. There's a wave of Protestant, kind of a Protestant wave that was happening right then. If you've ever heard the term fundamentalism in religion, that term would actually begin about 1910, 1911. So we're in that same area. Well, Christianity. What is, now McKinley probably had no idea about the people of the Philippines. No idea. Got to be honest, I don't think McKinley knew much. But most Americans probably didn't know anything about the Philippines either. What is so wrong about this statement?
They were already civilized.
Not even civilized. Christian. The Philippines have been a Spanish colony for 400 years. 90% of the Filipinos were Catholic. So we're going to bring Christianity to the Christians. But they assume most Americans didn't know. And, oh, they must be savages, headhunters, cannibals. No, not at all. But they played on American ignorance. That would never happen today. No, similar things happen now, especially when they talk about places like the Mideast. It's shocking how little people know. Me included. We don't know as much as we should. I'm not saying, boy, I'm so smart. Let's put it this way. We as in, not us, we know, right? Emilio Aguinaldo right here was the leader of these people as they sought their freedom fighters. And I think he's a pretty amazing guy. Very young. He was a teacher and a lawyer. So obviously, if he's a teacher, you can't trust him. But they used guerrilla tactics, mountainous area. They had very poor weapons. They've been fighting the Spanish, and now they'll fight the Americans. And eventually, 270,000 U.S. troops would go. There was a very popular carnival game, and this cartoon shows it, where they put up a sheet, and somebody, and a hole in it, and somebody would stick their head into the sheet, or through that hole, and people would pay money to throw things like rotten tomato or manure at it, and try to hit them in the face. You know, stick their face in, like that. So you get the gist of that. It was almost always, these are carnivals in white areas, and almost always a black man. Almost always. It would be this horrible racist joke about it. Well, it's using that same thing. It's really hard to fight a guerrilla army, especially when you send a bunch of people from the United States to fight in the Philippines. They can't speak Filipino or Spanish, which are the two main languages. Filipino is not kind of a combination of it. They speak English. How do you fight a guerrilla if you can't even speak the language? And so they can't find them. And so here's Uncle Sam throwing troops at him, and look at all that are dying. It's a very effective ad, and who's cheering him on? That's McKinley, and remember Marcus Hanna, the political boss. It's a clever cartoon. And this would be a brutal, awful war, following the pattern of all guerrilla war. Oh, here's another cartoon. Don't worry about this one. This is supposed to be, it says Aguinaldo. And look how they draw Aguinaldo. Remember the picture we just saw? Compare the picture. Let's go back one more time. All right? Look how they draw him. Using racism to justify it. It's shocking, isn't it? Look at the feet, look at the hands. Yeah.
Also with the bow and the dress, isn't it like almost a emasculization?
A what?
Emasculization of.
Yeah, you're right. It is exactly like that. It's supposed to look like a really racist term called pickaninny. Yeah, that's what they call it.
Because the U.S. has a history of emasculizing.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's actually really common. But they would do it also to Africans.
Yeah.
Anybody who is not Caucasian. America would not be the only one. Anybody who would become an imperial power did it. Japan would do it. The Chinese. Yeah. So, all you need to know is this. It basically followed this basic pattern. American soldiers be ambushed. And what would they want if they were ambushed? You're terrified, you're ambushed, your friend is killed. What do you want? But who's the enemy? So they find a town and have reprisals, burn it down. Because they must have helped. Repeat. And by the way, every time you burn down a town, you create more guerrillas. It's a horrific measure. For example, there was an attack on an American encampment in a place called Balanga. And General Homer Smith, he was a Marine general right here. He ordered a reprisal at the nearby village of Penang. And they killed, the orders he gave his men, everybody they find over the age of 10, shoot. So here's a picture of it. Here's the outcome. Those are bodies of men, women, and children, 10, so children, lined up and shot by American forces. There's no excuse for that crime. But think about the people who ordered those, at this time, young men. Stuff like this happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. You put young men and women in incredibly stressful positions, and they do horrific things. I know we'd all like to think that we don't do that. You have no idea until you're in it. No idea! So here are actually, these are Filipino forces. Here's another, that's a picture just a U.S. soldier took killing Filipino civilians. Imperial War. That's what we signed up for, we as a country. And it still goes on. But to end this thing, Roosevelt finally got a general out, and probably putting a military man in charge. A military man sees everything in the military point of view. To a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Which I think is my favorite analogies. Sometimes you need a different point of view. And Taft would begin to try to find a way to peace by setting up a Filipino government and giving them more autonomy. And yes, that's Taft on a water buffalo. You can't argue with the simple fact that that is an awesome picture. And yes, Taft was a big man.
Taft, right? Knows Taft.
Yeah. So, finally, the United States would have peace, and this would be the last real attempt at pure colonial imperialism. It was such a disaster. I mean, the U.S. would try economic imperialism all over. And we're still in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, but never quite to create an American colony. It's more complex. It's economic. But all Granada was captured. And basically, Taft hammered an agreement. Please, we'll quit. We'll give you relative self-rule and then independence on July 4th, 1946. And this would happen. Even after the Japanese took the American colony into the Philippines in World War II, when the U.S. took it back in 1945, still gave them independence, even though the U.S. would keep a military base until the 1980s, until the Filipinos kicked the U.S. out. But, once again, you don't need to know the exact numbers, except I do want you to pay attention to this. Look how many civilians died. Partially being killed, partially by disease that was caused by all the people being cooped together in these camps, cholera. And a horrific war. And yes, the U.S. would do many of the same things they accused the Spanish of. And you might be thinking, oh, the U.S. would learn from this. It's amazing how fast people forget. We're seeing it right now in Texas. 2011, there was a horrible polar vortex, not quite as cold, but really bad. Blackouts all over, people froze to death in Texas. What's happening right now? And they said, we got to spend money to winterize our gas. That was a big thing with natural gas mains froze. Big thing, that's what happened. They try to blame wind power, but that's garbage. And the natural gas mains blew. And they said, we got to spend this money. We got to do this because it's going to happen again. Did they do this? No, they actually did nothing. So it's even worse now than it was in 2011. It's shocking how people forget, but it's also Texas.
Ted Cruz went to Mexico to escape the bullet.
Yeah, I know.
Some Cruz.
He probably saw nothing wrong with that. So while this is going on, let's have an election. Now, the Philippines was not quite as bad as people thought. So actually, there was kind of a euphoria. The economy was better. We won the war. And William McKinley would run for re-election. But his running mate, this we have to get down, Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt was able to take the fame of the Rough Riders, literally got back to the United States, ran for governor of New York, and became governor of the richest and most populous state at that time. And he was a progressive. He was the mortal opposite of Marcus Hanna. And Marcus Hanna said, we got to get rid of him. We got to get him out of New York. Let's make him vice president. Because what do vice presidents do? Two things. Break ties in the Senate and wait for the president to die. This is what we call foreshadowing. But Hanna was overjoyed. He's out of the way, he's vice president. William Jennings Bryan, and I put the picture up here. That picture just makes me laugh. Bryan would run again, but his credibility was in the tanks. And he never recovered from dropping his opposition to the treaty. So it's Bryan against McKinley again, and McKinley won re-election. Bryan actually did a little bit worse. Bryan did a little bit worse. So everyone got that McKinley's president? And then what happened to McKinley? A wild boar entered the White House and gored him to death. Says right there.
Into the White House?
President dead of wounds sustained by his ferocious assault. Roosevelt sworn in vows to hunt down the villainous beast. Yes, that's The Onion. Do you know what The Onion is? It's a satirical newspaper, and they did all these headlines of the 20th century of this. And I thought this was hilarious. My favorite part is fisticuffsmanship. And then, of course, advances in balloon sciencing. This mankind have the wisdom to use the power responsibly. Remember, that's 2 years before the first flight? Yeah.
I like the one at the top right. Lightning quick 9-hour game.
Yeah, like, athletics beat the Red Stockings. Yeah. Even though they weren't the Red Stockings, they were the Reds. what really happened. It was not a pig. An anarchist. I didn't put this out to make sure you get an anarchist assassinated. McKinley. Leon Jagosh. He was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, and so that put in all the nativist thing. He tried to kill McKinley. There are anarchist assassinations all over the world. We talked about anarchism before. McKinley died. I love this picture, and I think you should too. So they just started putting guards with the president after Garfield was assassinated, and they really didn't have any national police force. There were U.S. Marshals, but they're in the territories. But there were Secret Service agents created in the Civil War to look for counterfeiters. So they grabbed them. That's why Secret Service, to this day, looks for counterfeiters and protects elected officials. Kind of a weird combination, isn't it? So this is one of his guards. And look at the guard. Doesn't it look like he's using McKinley to shield him? At least I'm safe. Kind of the opposite of what you think a Secret Service agent would do. Jagosh thought it would create the revolution. He would be tried, convicted, and executed in less than a month. That's him in prison, so they roughed him up pretty good when they arrested him. And now, as Marcus Hanna said, that damned cowboy's in the White House. And Roosevelt would be the youngest man ever to be president, to this day. Kennedy was the youngest man ever elected president, but Roosevelt was elected vice president. Is it amazing? And now we have the oldest man to ever be president.
How old was Teddy when he got into office?
He just turned, or he was just about 41. And Kennedy was 40. Obama was pretty young, too, but in the 40s. Clinton was pretty young in his 40s. Yes.
Isn't there a rule that, like,
25 for the House, 30 for the Senate, 35 for the presidency. What's that?
I was going to ask.
But back in like the 1700s, that was basically ancient.
30%.
35 was like elderly back in the 1700s.
But actually, you know, if you got past 1 or 2, you went to your 60s.
Oh, wow.
The problem is getting to 1 or 2. Yeah, life expectancy is always a little bit misleading. Of course, it just went down 2.7 years this year.
I heard it was won by NPR.
Good
Huh?
news.
I heard it was won by NPR.
Well, NPR is fake news. So.
1 year?
Yeah, they said that the U.S. national average life expectancy went down.
You could be right. Maybe I misread it.
I mean,
1 or 2. It's still
that's impressive. Yeah, that COVID.
I mean, point 1 is a lot.
Yeah, an entire year though.
Oh, it was it'll be worse next year. Hopefully they'll over. Fingers crossed. Just up to somebody got quarantined. I ran him out. I got tired. He's totally out of control. You agree? You're on film, you sure? Yeah, he's quarantined. What a thing. What a thing. Oh, do you have your registration, or did you already turn it? No, I'm going to take, yeah, I'll take them all. What I have today, I'll take them all today.